Isaac Emmanuilovich Babel was a Russian-language journalist, playwright, literary translator, and short story writer. He is best known as the author of Red Cavalry, story of My Dovecote, and Tales of Odessa, all of which are considered masterpieces of Russian literature. Babel has also been acclaimed as the greatest prose writer of Russian Jewry, loyal to, but not uncritical of, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Babel fell victim to Joseph Stalin's Great Purge as the result of his long-term affair with the wife of NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov. Babel was arrested by the NKVD at Peredelkino on the night of the 15th of May 1939. After confessing under interrogation to being a Trotskyist terrorist and foreign spy, he was shot on the 27th of January 1940. Early years. Isaac Babel was born in the Moldavanka section of Odessa to Manus and Figa Babel. Soon after his birth, the Babel family moved to the port city of Mykolaiv. They later returned to live in a more fashionable part of Odessa in 1906. Babel used Moldavanka as the setting for the Odessa Tales and the play Sunset. Although Babel's short stories present his family as destitute and muddle-headed, they were relatively well-off. According to his autobiographical statements, Babel's father, Manus, was an impoverished shopkeeper. Babel's daughter, Natalie Babel Brown, stated that her father fabricated this and other biographical details in order to present an appropriate past for a young Soviet writer who was not a member of the Communist Party. In fact, Babel's father was a dealer in farm implements and owned a large warehouse. In his teens, Babel hoped to get into the preparatory class of the Nikolai Odessa Commercial School. However, he first had to overcome the Jewish quota. Despite the fact that Babel received passing grades, his place was given to another boy whose parents had bribed school officials. As a result, he was schooled at home by private tutors. In addition to regular school subjects, Babel studied the Talmud and music. According to Cynthia Ozick, though he was at home in Yiddish and Hebrew, and was familiar with the traditional texts and the demanding commentaries, he added to these a lifelong fascination with Maupassant and Flaubert. His first stories were composed in fluent literary French. The breadth and scope of his social compass enabled him to see through the eyes of peasants, soldiers, priests, rabbis, children, artists, actors, women of all classes. He befriended whores, cab drivers, jockeys. He knew what it was like to be penniless, to live on the edge and off the beaten track. Quote, after the Jewish quota also foiled an attempt to enroll at Odessa University, Babel entered the Kiev Institute of Finance and Business. There he met Yevgenia Borisovna Gromfin, daughter of a wealthy industrialist. She eventually eloped with him to Odessa. Early career. In 1915, Babel graduated and moved to Petrograd, in defiance of laws restricting Jews to living within the Pale of Settlement. Babel was fluent in French, besides Russian, Ukrainian and Yiddish, and his earliest works were written in French. However, none of his stories in that language have survived. In St. Petersburg, Babel met Maxim Gorky, who published some of Babel's stories in his literary magazine Letopis. Gorky advised the aspiring writer to gain more life experience. Babel wrote in his autobiography, I owe everything to that meeting and still pronounce the name of Alexei Maximovich Gorky with love and admiration. One of his most famous semi-autobiographical short stories, The Story of My Dovecote, was dedicated to Gorky. The story, The Bathroom Window, was considered obscene by censors, and Babel was charged with violating Criminal Code Article 1001. There is very little information about Babel's whereabouts during and after the October Revolution. According to one of his stories, The Road, he served on the Romanian front until early December 1917. He resurfaced in Petrograd in March 1918 as a reporter for Gorky's Menshevik newspaper, Novaya Zhizn. Babel continued publishing there until Novaya Zhizn was forcibly closed on Lenin's orders in July 1918. Babel later recalled, "My journalistic work gave me a lot, especially in the sense of material. I managed to amass an incredible number of facts, which proved to be an invaluable creative tool. I struck up friendships with morgue attendants, criminal investigators, and government clerks. Later, when I began writing fiction, I found myself always returning to these subjects which were so close to me, in order to put character types, situations, and everyday life into perspective. Journalistic work is full of adventure." October's withered leaves. During the Russian Civil War, which led to the party's monopoly on the printed word, Babel worked for the publishing house of the Odessa Gubcom, in the food procurement unit, in the Narcom Prose, and in a typographic printing office. After the end of the Civil War, Babel worked as a reporter for the Dawn of the Orient, a Russian-language newspaper published in Tbilisi. In one of his articles, he expressed regret that Lenin's controversial new economic policy had not been more widely implemented. Babel married Yevgenia Gromfin on August 9, 1919 in Odessa. In 1929, their marriage produced a daughter, Natalie Babel Brown, who grew up to become a scholar and editor of her father's life and work. By 1925, the Babels' marriage was souring. Yevgenia Babel, feeling betrayed by her husband's infidelities and motivated by her increasing hatred of communism, emigrated to France. Babel saw her several times during his visits to Paris. During this period, he also entered into a long-term romantic relationship with Tamara Kashirina. Together, they had a son, Emmanuel Babel, who was later adopted by his stepfather Vsevolod Ivanov. Emmanuel's name was changed to Mikhail Ivanov, and he later became a noted artist. After the final break with Tamara, Babel briefly attempted to reconcile with Yevgenia, and they had their daughter Natalie in 1929. In 1932, Babel met a Siberian-born Gentile named Antonina Pirozhkova. In 1934, after Babel failed to convince his wife to return to Moscow, he and Antonina began living together. In 1939, their common-law marriage produced a daughter, Lydia Babel. According to Pirozhkova, "Before I met Babel, I used to read a great deal, though without any particular direction. I read whatever I could get my hands on." Babel noticed this and told me, "Reading that way will get you nowhere. You won't have time to read the books that are truly worthwhile. There are about 100 books that every educated person needs to read. Sometime I'll try to make you a list of them." And a few days later he brought me a list. There were ancient writers on it, Greek and Roman, Homer, Herodotus, Lucretius, Suetonius, and also all the classics of later European literature, starting with Erasmus, Rabelais, Cervantes, Swift, and Costa, and going on to 19th-century writers such as Stendhal, Mary Mayer, and Flaubert. Red Cavalry. In 1920, Babel was assigned to command Arm Semyon Budyonny's 1st Cavalry Army, witnessing a military campaign of the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. Poland was not alone in its newfound opportunities and troubles. Virtually all of the newly independent neighbors began fighting over borders. Romania fought with Hungary over Transylvania, Yugoslavia with Italy over Rijeka, and Poland with Czechoslovakia over Cieszyn Silesia, with Germany over Poznan, and with Ukrainians over eastern Galicia. He documented the horrors of the war he witnessed in the 1920s 1920 diary, which he later used to write Red Cavalry, a collection of short stories such as Crossing the River Zbrucz and My First Goose. The legendary violence of Red Cavalry seemed to harshly contrast the gentle nature of Babel himself. Babel wrote, "Only by 1923 I have learned how to express my thoughts in a clear and not very lengthy way. Then I returned to writing." Several stories that were later included in Red Cavalry were published in Vladimir Mayakovsky's Lef magazine in 1924. Babel's honest description of the brutal realities of war, far from revolutionary propaganda, earned him some powerful enemies. According to recent research, Marshal Budyonny was infuriated by Babel's unvarnished descriptions of marauding Red Cossacks and demanded Babel's execution without success. However, Gorky's influence not only protected Babel but also helped to guarantee publication. In 1929 Red Cavalry was translated into English by J. Harland and later was translated into a number of other languages. Argentine author and essayist Jorge Luis Borges once wrote of Red Cavalry, "The music of its style contrasts with the almost ineffable brutality of certain scenes." One of the stories, Salt, enjoys a glory seemingly reserved for poems and rarely attained by prose. Many people know it by heart. Odessa Tales. Back in Odessa, Babel started to write the Odessa Tales, a series of short stories set in the Odessan ghetto of Moldavanka. At their core, the stories described the life of Jewish gangsters, both before and after the October Revolution. Many of them directly feature the fictional mob boss Benya Krik, who remains one of the great anti-heroes of Russian literature. These stories were later used as the basis for the stage play Sunset, which centers on Benya Krik's self-appointed mission to right the wrongs of Moldavanka. First on his list is to rein in his alcoholic, womanizing father, Mendel. According to Natalie Babel Brown, Sunset premiered at the Baku Workers' Theatre on October 23, 1927 and played in Odessa, Kiev, and the celebrated Moscow Art Theatre. The reviews, however, were mixed. Some critics praised the play's powerful anti-bourgeois stance and its interesting fathers and sons theme. But in Moscow, particularly, critics felt that the play's attitude toward the bourgeoisie was contradictory and weak. Sunset closed and was dropped from the repertoire of the Moscow Art Theatre. However, Sunset continued to have admirers. In a 1928 letter to his white émigré father, Boris Pasternak wrote, "Yesterday, I read Sunset, a play by Babel, and almost for the first time in my life I found that Jewry, as an ethnic fact, was a phenomenon of positive, unproblematic importance and power. I should like you to read this remarkable play." Quote. According to P. Rozhkova, filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein was also an admirer of Sunset and often compared it to the writings of Émile Zola IV, illuminating capitalist relationships through the experience of a single family. Eisenstein was also quite critical of the Moscow Art Theatre for its weak staging of the play, particularly for failing to convey to the audience every single word of its unusually terse text. Glory days. According to Natalie Babel Brown, the young writer burst upon the literary scene and instantly became the rage in Moscow. The tradition in Russia being to worship poets and writers, Babel soon became one of the happy few, a group that included Soviet writers who enjoyed exceptional status and privileges in an otherwise impoverished and despotic country. In the late 1930s, he was given a villa in the writers' colony of Purge Borodilkino, outside Moscow. No secret was ever made of his having a wife and daughter in Paris. At the same time, hardly anyone outside of Moscow knew of 2 other children he had fathered. As a matter of fact, Babel had many secrets, lived with many ambiguities and contradictions, and left many unanswered questions behind him. Clashes with the authorities. In 1930, Babel traveled in Ukraine and witnessed the brutality of forced collectivization and decularization. Although he never made a public statement about this, he privately confided in Antonina, "The bounty of the past is gone. It is due to the famine in Ukraine and the destruction of the village across our land." As Stalin tightened his grip on the Soviet intelligentsia and decreed that all writers and artists must conform to socialist realism, Babel increasingly withdrew from public life. During the campaign against formalism, Babel was publicly denounced for low productivity. At the time, many other Soviet writers were terrified and frantically rewrote the past work to conform to Stalin's wishes. However, Babel was unimpressed and confided in his protege, the writer Ilya Ehrenberg, "In 6 months' time, they will leave the formalists in peace and start some other campaign." At the first Congress of the Union of Soviet Writers, Babel noted ironically that he was becoming the master of a new literary genre, the genre of silence. American Max Eastman describes Babel's increasing reticence as an artist in a chapter called The Silence of Isaac Babel in his 1934 book, Artists in Uniform. Maria. Babel's play Maria candidly depicts both political corruption, prosecution of the innocent, and black marketeering within Soviet society. Noting the play's implicit rejection of socialist realism, Maxim Gorky accused his friend of having a Baudelairian predilection for rotting meat. Gorky further warned his friend that political inferences would be made that will be personally harmful to you. Quote, according to P. Rozhkova, once Babel went to the Moscow Art Theatre when his play Maria was being given its first reading, and when he returned home he told me that all the actresses had been impatient to find out what the leading female role was like and who would be cast in it. It turned out that there was no leading female character present on the stage in this play. Babel thought that the play had not come off well, but it should be noted that he was always critical of his own work. Quote, although intended to be performed in 1935, the Maria's performance was cancelled by the NKVD during rehearsals. Despite its popularity in the West, Maria was not performed in Russia until after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Karl Weber, a former disciple of Bertolt Brecht, directed Maria at Stanford University in 2004. According to Weber, the play is very controversial, shows the stories of both sides clashing with each other during the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks and the old society members, without making a judgment one way or another. Babel's opinion on either side is very ambiguous, but he does make the statement that what happened after the Bolshevik Revolution may not have been the best thing for Russia. Paris. In 1932, after numerous requests, he was permitted to visit his estranged wife Yevgenia in Paris. While visiting his wife and the daughter Natalie, Babel agonized over whether or not to return to Soviet Russia. In conversations and letters to friends, he expressed a longing of being a free man, while also expressing fear at no longer being able to make a living solely through writing. On July 27, 1933, Babel wrote a letter to Yuri Annemkov, stating that he had been summoned to Moscow and was leaving immediately. Babel's common-law wife, Antonina Pirozhkova, recalled this era. Babel remained in France for so long that it was rumored in Moscow that he was never returning. When I wrote to him about this, he wrote back saying, "What can people who do not know anything possibly say to you, who knows everything?" Babel wrote from France almost daily. I accumulated many letters from him during his 11-month absence. When Babel was arrested in 1939, all of these letters were confiscated and never returned to me." Quote, after his return to Russia, Babel decided to move in with Purge, beginning a common-law marriage which would ultimately produce a daughter, Lydia Babel. He also collaborated with Sergei Eisenstein on the film Bezhan Meadow, about Pavlik Morozov, a child informant for the Soviet secret police. Babel also worked on the screenplays for several other Stalinist propaganda films. Escape clause. According to Natalie Babel Brown, Babel came to Paris in the summer of 1935, as part of the delegation of Soviet writers to the International Congress of Writers for the Defense of Culture and Peace. He probably knew this would have been his last chance to remain in Europe, as he had done numerous times during the last 10 years. He asked my mother to return with him to Moscow. Although he knew the general situation was bad, he nevertheless described to her the comfortable life that the family could have there together. It was the last opportunity my mother had to give a negative answer, and she never forgot it. Perhaps it helped her later on to be proven completely right in her fears and her total lack of confidence in the Soviet Union. My mother described to me these last conversations with my father many times. Relationship with the Yezhovs. During a visit to Berlin, the married Babel began an affair with Yevgenia Feigenberg, who was then a translator at the Soviet embassy. Simon Sebag Montefiore has dubbed Yevgenia an irrepressible literary groupie. Quote, according to Babel's interrogation transcripts, she began her seduction of the writer with the words, "You don't know me, but I know you well." Even after Yevgenia married NKVD boss Nikolai Yezhov, the affair continued, and Babel frequently presided over Mrs. Yezhov's literary gatherings, which often included such luminaries as Solomon Mikhails, Leonid Utasov, Sergei Eisenstein, and Mikhail Koltsov. On one such occasion, Babel was heard to say, "Just think, our girl from Odessa has become the first lady of the kingdom." In her memoirs, Antonina professes complete ignorance of her common-law husband's affair with Mrs. Yezhov. Babel informed her that his interest in the Yezhovs was purely professional, and was tied to his desire to understand the party elite. In retaliation for Babel's affair with his wife, Yezhov ordered the writer placed under constant NKVD surveillance. As the Great Purge began during the late 1930s, Yezhov was informed that Babel was spreading rumors about the suspicious death of Maxim Gorky and alleging that his former mentor had been murdered. On orders from Stalin, Babel had also been heard to say of Leon Trotsky, "It's impossible to imagine the charm and strength of his influence on anyone who encounters him." Babel further commented that Lev Kamenev was the most brilliant connoisseur of language and literature. As the number of Purge victims skyrocketed, however, Nikolai Yezhov's overenthusiastic pursuit of suspected enemies began to be thought a liability by Stalin and his inner circle. In response, Lavrentiy Beria was assigned as Yezhov's assistant and swiftly usurped the leadership of the NKVD. According to Montefiore, the darkness began to descend upon Yezhov's family, where his silly, sensual wife was unwittingly to play the terrible role of Black Widow Spider. Most of her lovers were to die. She herself was too sensitive a flower for Yezhov's world. Both she and Yezhov were promiscuous, but by then they lived in a world of high tension, dizzy power over life and death, and dynamic turmoil as men rose and fell around them. If there was justice in Yezhov's fall, it was a tragedy for Yevgenia and little Natasha, to whom he was a kind father. A pall fell on Yevgenia's literary salon. When a friend walked her home to the Kremlin after a party, she herself reflected that Babel was in danger because he had been friends with arrested Trotskyite generals. Only his European fame could save him. she herself was in greater danger. Arrest. On May 15, 1939, Antonina Pirozhkova was awakened by 4 NKVD agents pounding upon the door of the Moscow apartment. Although surprised, she agreed to accompany them to Babel's dacha in Peredelkino. Babel was then placed under arrest. According to Pirozhkova, in the car, one of the men sat in back with Babel and me while the other one sat in front with the driver. The worst part of this is that my mother won't be getting my letters. And then he was silent for a long time. I could not say a single word. Babel asked the secret policeman sitting next to him, "So I guess you don't get too much sleep, do you?" And he even laughed. As we approached Moscow, I said to Babel, "I'll be waiting for you. It will be as if you've gone to Odessa. Only there won't be any letters. ... He answered, "I ask you to see that the child not be made miserable. But I don't know what my destiny will be." At this point, the man sitting beside Babel said to me, "We have no claims whatsoever against you." We drove to the Lubyanka prison and through the gates. The car stopped before the massive, closed door where 2 sentries stood guard. Babel kissed me hard and said, "Someday we'll see each other." And without looking back, he got out of the car and went through the door. According to Nadezhda Mandelstam, Babel's arrest became the subject of an urban legend within the NKVD. NKVD agents, she explains, were fond of telling stories about the risks they ran in arresting enemies of the people. Babel had, according to NKVD law, seriously wounded one of our men while resisting arrest. Mrs. Mandelstam contemptuously declared, "Whenever I hear such tales I think of the tiny hole in the skull of Isaac Babel, a cautious, clever man with a high forehead, who probably never once in his life held a pistol in his hands."